1974 and 1880.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. But although, of course, the term "one nation" was really first used by Stanley Baldwin in the 1920s. So, now the extent to which there's been a revival of one nation conservatism in more recent times has also been debated. I'm getting lots of messages on the screen, so apologies for that. So we wanted to build on previous work that we've done, particularly an article which I wrote with Ben Williams, who's going to speak in a moment, and Robert Page from the University of Birmingham, which we wrote for the Journal of Political Ideologies a few years ago about the extent to which Theresa May had returned to or revived a one nation form of conservatism. But although it's been around, the term one nation conservative has been around for the length of time that we've just mentioned, the term itself is a very ambiguous one. And so what we did was to engage with two recent writers on one nation conservatism, namely Mark Garnett, who collaborated with Ian Gilmore and regarded that kind of Gilmoreite conservatism as the authentic meaning of one nation conservative politics, and also David Seawright, whose own work on one nation conservatism has been fairly extensive, and really there were problems we thought with both of these approaches. Garnett's definition of one nation conservatism being too narrow, it was limited purely to the kind of post-war, post-Second World War form of conservatism, of which Gilmore was really the last blast in those arguments between the so-called wets and the dries in the early 1980s. And really one nation conservatism we thought should be seen as being broader than this. But at the same time, Seawright's work, which did attempt to create a broader definition of one nation conservatism, we thought was too loose. It's essentially defined as a political space within which debate could take place within the Conservative Party while maintaining the unity of the party. So what we did was to come up with a spectrum of one nation conservatism, rather than seeing it as a fixed ideological position, rather to see it as a spectrum, where at one end you had a softer version of one nation conservatism, which is essentially defined in terms of political rhetoric, the language of social unity, social consensus, of which, for instance, Stanley Baldwin would be a clear example, and a harder notion, or further, stronger notion of one nation conservatism, which was more concerned with the level, or at the level of policy. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. You can, of course, be both. But at the softer end of the one nation definition of conservatism that we formulated, it's essentially about political rhetoric, and the harder notion more about policy. And Cameron clearly fitted, we argued, into the softer version of one nation conservatism, but because of the austerity policies and so on which were pursued by the coalition government, there was nothing really firmer than that. May, we argued, went beyond that. She did engage in one nation political rhetoric, particularly after the 2016 Brexit referendum, with the need to heal the social divisions and so on, a number of speeches, prominent speeches, which she gave. And to some extent, in terms of policy as well, we talked about the various examples of May's policies, which we believe fitted into that kind of one nation framework. But of course, the government was dominated by the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. And of course, that's ultimately the reason why she fell, because she couldn't get the deal through, which carried the support of Conservative politicians. So that was published, as I said, a while ago in the Journal of Political Ideologies. And we've now been asked to write, or agreed to publish an article which we're writing at the moment on the extent to which Johnson fits into one nation conservatism, again defined in that same way as a spectrum of opinion, which is going to be published next year, I think, in the French Journal of the Review of British Civilization journal. So we're working on that at the moment, the extent to which Johnson has said fits into this definition of one nation conservatism, both the softer version of one nation, the rhetoric which Johnson has employed, and the extent to which he's developed a clear set of one nation policies, which is what Ben is going to talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so Kevin's just given us kind of like the context and the history and the theoretical kind of background to what we're looking at. I'm going to move on and look about some specific kind of ideas about Boris Johnson himself. I suppose these are just ideas we're throwing around, playing around at the moment, but as part of the analysis as to whether, Johnson fits into the one nation kind of tradition or how he diverges from it in some respects. So obviously, one of the things about Johnson, which I think has come up already, and you'll probably all be familiar with, he's not that easy to pin down in terms of some of his arguments, some of his rhetoric is actually kind of slightly inconsistent at times. So it's sort of fluid, can't always be precisely defined. He's repeatedly called himself a one nation conservative and said he wants to unify rather than divide. And again, rhetorically, yes, that appears to be true. However, while he often has expressed sort of social liberal views, unifying views, the policies and political positioning that he's then adopted have not always been consistent with what he's actually said. So this has been mentioned already today. Johnson clearly employs populist tactics and approaches. There's an image there suggesting sort of Trump tactics. And since he became PM in mid-2019, about 3 years ago now, he has taken at times often uncompromising and divisive positions aligned with populism, often linked to Brexit. And you can certainly say that this has not been socially unifying. In fact, it's actually been polarizing in many respects, exacerbating the divisions of 2016. He's repeatedly also called himself a Thatcherite, which again, you could say is a kind of not consistent with the sort of one nation comments. He's expressed individualistic and libertarian anxieties about pandemic lockdowns. That was mentioned earlier on by people saying he was sort of cautious and reluctant to go into lockdown. He's condemned ongoing EU interventions, regulations from the EU. His Brexit agenda, of course, did deliver a democratic outcome in line with what people voted for, but it can be observed that the nationalistic and often Trumpian undertones are detached from what you would call one nation traditions, words we would call concepts such as consensus, paternalism, cooperation, internationalism. That appears detached from the actions that he's actually taken in a more populist style, which of course was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations. Again, pragmatic. Is he more pragmatic than ideological? Obviously, he's won an election. He got Brexit done, as it were. And some skeptics question his one nation credentials. Does he really mean them? Or is he really employing this in a kind of pragmatic, popular electioneering mode? He has spoke positively about society. He has favoured more expansive post-austerity social policy commitments. And this is where we say in the article, I think we're going to argue that he has transcended Theresa May, or is proposing to transcend Theresa May if he can deliver. Political commentators have also observed that by adhering to the moderate political centre, which you could say is more linked to one nation, that's actually the route to electoral success for the Conservatives going forward. And this has been noted, for example, on multiple occasions, but particularly by Goodwin, and there's a tweet there that has said this, where in 2019 he observed the Conservatives moved leftward on economic issues and intervention, aligned with state paternalism, but combined that with a rightward focus on social and cultural issues, and that gave them electoral benefits as a result. And as someone said before, that kind of splits the left as well in some of those approaches. Again, this is all linked to, of course, the development of the so-called Red Wall. Obviously, in 2019, the Red Wall was targeted in advance. It was actually coined before the election by Kangasorian, one of the advisors to the Conservatives, who identified this swathe of seats that were vulnerable to this kind of different Conservative approach to politics, to the electoral strategy. And in the aftermath of winning the election and seizing a large number of seats in this area, Johnson again used the rhetoric of one nation. We must recognise the incredible reality that we now speak as a one nation Conservative Party. And this seemed to reaffirm his credentials regarding the need for unifying and cohesive positions across social economic spheres, and in particular, of course, to maintain that electoral coalition that he's now established going forward. The one nation language, the one nation approach was linked to keeping these people, these new voters, on side. In particular, of course, in terms of hard policy, the policy formulation in recent months appears to be this concept of levelling up. He did talk about levelling up kind of about the time of the general election, and he's talked about it a lot afterwards. The idea, of course, is to tackle entrenched ongoing divides, public investment, greater public investments, opportunity for these left behind areas. However, of course, this policy does involve significant government expenditure, and delivering it in practical terms is a challenge, which of course is a subject of ongoing debate. There was a Panorama programme just last week, which was alleging that it's being used in a way to siphon money into Conservative-run areas in a kind of pork barrel approach to politics, which critics have picked up on and have made some sort of running with. The trend for a more interventionist socio-economic approach, though, as a number of people have mentioned today, was of course heightened by the pandemic. And of course, this saw further departure from the kind of new right neoliberal legacy and towards, of course, what are one nation tendencies of interventionist state-funded, generous public policies. And of course, this is aligned with the budgets of recent years. It has been noted that under Boris Johnson, the budgets have been heightened to levels unprecedented in the post-war era. And of course, we're seeing this week again, the so-called new windfall tax. That again is a further example of intervention expenditure, which of course you'd say fits in with the more generous one nation principles. So in terms of our kind of concluding arguments, the direction we're going with this, of course it is sort of evolving. We're going to write the article. As with some other recent 21st century prime ministers, probably we could agree that Johnson's alignment and positioning, of course, is an area of debate. People might have different views of where you place Johnson, but it's not always that easy to define because, as we've already highlighted, he has kind of said inconsistent things and done and said things that don't tally up with previous things that he's said. So we therefore think it's an academic area of interest. In terms of recent history, you could arguably say it's easier to categorise the likes of Thatcher, who was clearly, aligned with the new right, Heath perhaps, who was more technocratic in the 70s and 80s. But in the modern era, where we're kind of like a more consumer politics, where ideology often gets abandoned for being popular, politicians have therefore sought to broaden their appeal and dilute previous ideological tendencies. So what's saying is that Johnson is a populist, perhaps the archetypal populist of the 21st century. He has employed an adaptable and flexible approach. He's willing certainly to use the language and rhetoric of one nation beyond potentially anything Cameron and May did. Although we do say, and we'll come to this just in our conclusion, and as Kevin alluded to, we do argue that May went beyond Cameron, so therefore potentially moving in that direction, Johnson potentially could go beyond May if he delivers some of the things he said he would do. Okay, so just to refer back to our article that we wrote in 2020, in our 2020 article, as Kevin referred to before, we put Theresa May on a spectrum. And we said that actually she used both the rhetoric and the policy. And her political rhetoric certainly talked of achieving a greater degree of social harmony post-Brexit, tackling social injustice. I suppose in her defence, she was dealt a difficult hand, you could say. She obviously called the election and lost her majority. And this certainly limited her capacity to deliver what she then said she proposed to do. Johnson, we argue, potentially does demonstrate both elements of the hard and soft one nation conservatism. He's made repeated speeches where he's referenced one nation. He's talked about greater social harmony and unity, particularly so in the aftermath of the 2019 election. He's also, as we've said, developed policies in this direction, not least with this year's Levelling Up white paper. But again, we do highlight the proof will be in the eating, as it were. Is he going to be able to deliver this, particularly in the context of ongoing economic issues, the impact of the war in Ukraine, energy costs, cost of living crisis? So, just to finally conclude our summary overview and developing arguments, Johnson's advocacy of one nation conservatism is partly through necessity, because of course the COVID pandemic created a need for a bigger state, more intervention, and also the fact that when the Conservatives gained seats in the Red Wall, those voters in a way want more state intervention, want more kind of the levelling up agenda, which of course has financial implications. But Johnson himself has indicated he and some of his advisors would like to develop a more modernised, contemporary form of one nation conservatism, that while acknowledging Thatcherism is seeking to offer something different and moving on from the past. So, as our arguments will develop and as hopefully our journal article will be produced in due course, conclusion is that given the growing criticism and calls for Johnson to resign, of course that's been going on this week, our arguments, our analysis is going to speculate about whether the prospects of one nation conservatism now are here to kind of stay and be maintained. And even if Johnson is removed and even if Johnson leaves, has he created momentum for a future Conservative leader to take this forward in the same direction, following these kind of principles and goals? Okay, and I think that's where we just concluded. Okay, thanks very much. Okay. Okay, so much, yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much to Kevin and Ben. So next up, we've only got two papers this time. Next up is Dr. Andy Knott of Brighton, Johnsonism as Conservatism and Nationalism. So does... Okay.
Hello. Can I be seen, heard? I've got a thumbs up from Danielle, so that suggests Zoom is working. I don't know if the physical conference has a connection with me. Thanks, Danielle.
Okay, Andy, we should.
Hello, can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, David, for putting on the conference, and thanks for inviting me. I'm a bit of a techno idiot, even though I'm doing this online, and I am going to share a screen with you for a limited amount of time. But broadly, I'm coming from a position of political theory, and I'm going to focus mainly on drilling down into the concepts of conservatism and populism, but I will bring it back to Johnson. My argument differentiates me from everyone else so far here. I'm going to distance Johnson from populism and claim that at best the association between Johnson and populism is very limited. So that hopefully will at least prompt some kind of debate. So firstly, I'm going to just talk about populism. I spend most of my time talking about populism, actually. I'm part of the populism specialist group, and thanks a lot to David for inviting us along. I'm also conscious that Tim Bale is speaking later. He wrote an article alongside a few other academics all the way back in 2011 that went under the title Thrown Around with Abandon, with reference to populism. And I'm not entirely convinced that people have taken heed of his advice. One of the best ideas associated with populism is this notion of populist hype, which we've witnessed a great deal of, especially in Western Europe, especially from academics and from left-leaning newspapers like The Guardian, for instance. This is very peculiar to our particular moment. I think we have experienced and witnessed a kind of wave of populism over the last decade or so in Western Europe, but that's really our first acquaintance with it. And most of the literature pays very little heed to the history and the geography of populism, and it's very much informed by the contemporary circumstances. So this is the point where hopefully I'm going to start sharing a screen, and can somebody, it's come up for me, so and I think I've heard a yes. So here we are on the kind of question, what is populism? I think this is the best definition that I've encountered from Margaret Canavan. This is a wonderful little article by Margaret Canavan, and probably the reason why I like this definition an awful lot is it's the emphasis is what the people is against, and I'll return to this. And this is the established structure of power and the dominant ideas and values of the society. This is what constitutes populism, and I think that this very much points the appearance of populism to a crisis, and we might go even further and call that an hegemonic crisis. So I think that the reason why populism has been so prominent in Western Europe and beyond of late is because the hegemonic framework that we've had since Margaret Thatcher, which I refer to as neoliberal financialized globalization, that went into crisis in 2008. And I still think that we're playing out the aftermath of that crisis, and we haven't moved into a new hegemonic framework. There are various rivals vying to take up that particular mantle at the moment. So effectively, neoliberal financialized globalization followed on from what we might call Keynesianism or the post-war consensus, and so forth. Okay, so what's happened during this crisis is that the neoliberal financialized globalization is a quite careful formula, and I think that various forces have targeted each arm of that trident, as it were. And I think it's really the globalization that Johnson has targeted of those. Okay, I'm now going to move on to conservatism, and I'm heavily reliant upon Michael Frieden in terms of conservatism. I'm also highly persuaded by his account of ideology, and his account of ideology has also kind of distanced the association between that Kazmudakars, who claims that populism is an ideology. Frieden kind of rejects that. But yeah, Frieden's great on ideology as far as I'm concerned. It's his approach is the morphological approach, for those of you that are not familiar with it. And I think the morphological approach lends itself, of all the three, what he calls fixed-centered ideologies, conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, I think it lends itself especially towards conservatism. It's really, really useful for thinking about it. And the morphology is basically about an interaction between the ideas and the history. And the history is going of these core ideologies is going all the way back to the Enlightenment period, really. So at this point, I'm just going to run through some slides really quickly because I'm conscious of the lack of time. Here we are on this panel, and Ian Gilmore is getting his second mention here. And I'll come back to this, but effectively Gilmore is, I think, saying more or less the same thing that Frieden is saying in this slide as well. It's highlighting the way in which conservatism morphs quite brilliantly at times. And this is what I take to be the kind of four key features that Frieden is seeking to align with conservatism. Those two slides that I've just put up previously, I think are exemplifying the third core attribute of conservatism there. The fact that it morphs depends upon what it's reacting to. But I suppose it's really the first two of these that I'll come back to when I get on to Johnson. Okay, I now want to just move into a kind of quick discussion of the notion of the people, which is the most important political subject. And I think many understanders state that whenever a politician now invokes the notion of the people, they become a populist. But populism doesn't have sole ownership over the notion of the people. Historically, it's been widely invoked by fascism, by social democracy, and perhaps most consistently by conservatism. In other words, invoking the people doesn't make a politician, such as Johnson, a populist, and he has, of course, invoked the people. I'm just going to come out of that slide now. Hopefully I'll stop sharing, although I'm not succeeding in doing so. Okay, I can see you now. In terms of the people, there are various different understandings of it. The one that I want to highlight is a contrast between the populist understanding of the people, which seeks to form an antagonism against either an elite or, I think better as expressed by Canavan, the establishment. That very much differs from what I call the Hobbesian understanding of the people, which configures a kind of seamless whole between the leader and the main body of the population, which we might also refer to as the people. And I think once you draw that contrast, and I think it's really, really key, that contrast. It really does raise the question of the compatibility between conservatism and populism. Now, at this point, I'm going to move on to the final part of my paper, which is to move on to Johnson. Now, of course, he's been accused of being a populist, and this situates itself within what I call the crisis of neoliberal financialized globalization. And comparisons are drawn there between Brexit as a process and Johnson perhaps as a figurehead of Brexit, but also with Trump and Putin and many others. I think all of those are actually targeting the globalization aspect of what's gone into crisis. And we might ask the question is whether this has been done in order to protect the neoliberal and the financialized aspect. But I've just stated that invoking or mobilizing the people does not make a politician or a party or a movement, or even an ism such as Johnsonism, and I'm not really sure there is such a thing as Johnsonism yet, at the very least, but it doesn't make Johnson a populist. Such an invocation and mobilization has been done by conservatives for centuries. In order for a project to be populist, the people is projected as antagonistic to either somebody or something. So I'm returning to Canavan there with the notion of the establishment and the kind of dominant values there. Now, Johnson's never mobilized the people against the establishment. And I'll go even further than that and insist that if he were to do so, such a maneuver would constitute a decisive break with conservatism. And I think that I'm saying that because it contravenes at least the first two of Frieden's core attributes of conservatism. What Johnson has done, on the other hand, was to mobilise the people against Parliament. The Parliament that he mobilised against was never against the principle or continuity of Parliament, but rather about a very specific Parliament, the post-2017 Parliament. It was conducted in order to overcome multiple deep and protracted political difficulties, the resistance that was posed by Parliament against a hard Brexit, which we might now call a rash Brexit, by many parliamentarians, but also many prominent articulate Tories, or many who are now ex-Tories. It was also done to move beyond the impasse that the 2016 referendum had generated within the public. And it's to this extent that we could say that Johnson was a populist, because he has mobilised the people against Parliament. But that's only been done for a limited occasion. It hasn't been done subsequently. And I think if he's not a populist, what is he? Now, I agree with Kevin and Ben that he's quite difficult to pin down. The Grease Piglet quotation from David Cameron kind of sticks in my mind there, but I still think that broadly his project is a conservative one and a nationalist one, and I will end on that particular point.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. So do we have any questions from the virtual side of the conference? No, I can't, right? Anyone in person have any questions? Yeah. Okay, shall we go? Yeah.
One at a time?
Yeah, should we do one at a time? I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, just for the first panelists. I'm just wondering, because Yeah, if Johnson has shifted towards a rhetoric of one nationism, but that rhetoric doesn't include the Union, it just seems to focus on England, including the Red Wall. He seems to have neglected Scotland. He's definitely neglected Northern Ireland now with the this protocol. So does this signify a long-term shift in the nature of unionism, would you say? Sorry, in the nature of one nationism. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, Johnson, we talk about kind of a modernisation factor. You see that with Cameron, you see that with May. Johnson seems to have the rhetoric, but is substance free. I wondered what you thought about kind of uniting the kind of culture wars that Johnson has created in the division with his general kind of one nation conservative approach as well, because that seems quite hard to marry. And is the modernisation of the Conservative Party unfinished? And even after Johnson, that is something that needs to be delivered.
Yeah, I think should we just take those two for now and then, yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to?
It should pick you up there.
Right.
Sit down.
Okay. Okay, so I think what we were saying in the paper was that one nation conservatism historically has been defined very much by attitudes towards the state on economic and social policies. So one nation conservatives have been more willing to embrace kind of the more interventionist approach, more redistributive approach, high levels of public expenditure, things like that. So in terms of Johnsonism being substance free, I would argue the opposite in that sense, but maybe out of necessity rather than choice. But Johnson has clearly moved in a more interventionist direction because of the pandemic, because of the changed electoral arithmetic, as Ben was talking about, with the need to maintain, but try and maintain as much as possible this new electoral coalition that emerged after the 2019 election defeat. I think that contrasts starkly with Cameron, who was at a conference recently in Budapest. It was interesting because Philip Bond was one of the speakers, and he was saying clearly he was advising Cameron before the 2010 election, with the kind of red Tories and things like that. But his argument was that Cameron was pretty vacuous, really, and that largely followed Osborne's lead. Once he got into power, the austerity agenda wasn't a move towards a more substantive kind of one nation conservatism, in the sense that I think May started to do, and Johnson has gone further in that regard. In terms of Englishness, now I tend to argue that the Conservative Party is still essentially a unionist party. That actually it's had relatively little, I would suggest, to say on Englishness, either as a political manifestation or a cultural manifestation. It's still essentially a unionist party rather than an English party, and there's a relative silence, I would argue, in terms of Englishness in the Conservative Party, and in terms of, and certainly in terms of the Labour Party, where Englishness is always viewed with awkwardness.
I'll just make two quick points just in response to what's said. I mean, I think the point about the neglecting the wider union, I think that is a very good point. I mean, from my own personal views, I don't think Brexit is consistent with defending the traditional nation. I think actually Brexit is going to lead to, in the long term, the breakup of the United Kingdom. So I think that argument that Johnson is focusing more on England is valid. I think that was just on this morning with sort of English exceptionalism. I think there is evidence of that in some of the policies and some of the conversations that Johnson sort of has instigated. And also in terms of the second question, has the modernisation finished? I think it's ongoing. Personally, for my own, I did my PhD on this. I think it's ongoing. I think modernisation was disrupted by austerity, was disrupted by Brexit. we've gone beyond Brexit now, supposedly coming out to the other side of austerity, and Johnson's indicated we've left austerity behind to a degree. So I think actually modernisation is ongoing, and I think as Kevin has said, I think the saying he's got no substance is still open to debate, because if he does deliver on so-called levelling up, and there is some concrete evidence of it, and if this windfall tax has some sort of impact, even though he seems to stone for the Labour Party, then that will be some substance. And then I think that was what Red Wall voters would probably like, going back to the point about the Red Wall being part of this approach.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. It's been obviously up to this point.
Yeah.
And Andrew, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, just a quick question about the definition of rhetoric, if that's okay. First of all, thank you very much for both speakers, two very interesting papers, I thought. You characterize rhetoric as essentially a soft part of the communicative strategy, or at least the overarching governing strategy. But without the rhetoric, I'm sure you'll probably guess I'm going to make this kind of argument, you wouldn't be able to get to the policy stage, because it's, with rhetoric, you're able to communicate values, you're able to identify an audience, and then you're able to advocate policy to that audience. So when we talk about rhetoric, are we sure that just having it as a soft part of the process is truly reflective of the significance of the power of communication? Or are we using a different kind of definition? I'd be interested to hear what you
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't be dismissive of the use of political rhetoric, political language. It's important that you can deliver policies without any kind of overarching narrative. The meaning of the policies or the significance of the policies gets lost as well. So, but you know, I'll stick by the definition we've made before, that there are some conservative politicians who fit the one nation conservatism has purely been rhetoric. And there are other conservative politicians who have developed a more substantive agenda of one nation conservatism, particularly after 1945, and the way, you know, Ben, to go back to Ben's previous answer, Cameronism could be argued to be a purely rhetorical form of one nation conservatism, because this government was dominated by the imposition of the austerity agenda. May, of course, the Premiership was short-lived because of Brexit, but there was a combination of rhetoric and some policy initiatives. Because of things like the talked about the Red Wall and the levelling up agenda and the pandemic, and now because of the cost of living crisis, there is more scope for Johnson to develop a policy sense of one nation conservatism.
Do you agree that because somebody says they're one nation conservative, they don't say they are one nation conservative? I think every Tory leader for a while now has at some point claimed to be a one nation conservative. It doesn't matter if Thatcher did it in a conference speech, I think around 1987-88 time. So simply declaring yourself a one nation conservative doesn't make you one. I think that's I think you agree with that point. Thank you.
Yes, and you're right. Thatcher did employ the one nation rhetoric at some points. At other times, she said the one nation and no nations as well.
She used her own definition of one nation. She said that privatisation, shareholder economy, these are the notions of one nation, I am one nation conservative. She completely changed the definition of one nation in order to make that claim. It's a very powerful phrase to use with a claim of a sort of trajectory or various intellectual tradition, which many try to tap into because it seems to be more appealing to a wider electoral base, I would suggest.
Okay, do we have?
I agree with Kevin. No, yeah, totally agree with what Kevin said. Yeah.
Do we have any more comments or questions from our online conference? Any more in person?
Right.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Do you think it's a definitional problem as well, that one nation conservatism has evolved so much throughout, you know, the last 100 years, how we conceptualize it? It's actually used as a political instrument to kind of, you can sort of pull it apart and bend it to make it suit maybe what you want to get across. Do you think that's a problem?
I mean, just going to say, I mean, obviously, I know Andrew
we're not going into sort of rhetoric. You've got it to your articles. You're more of a sort of specialist expert in that. But I mean, I think the point is what we just said. I recall Ed Miliband at one point saying "One Nation Labour." I think at one point. So I think, yeah, in that case, people are using it as a kind of device to kind of get off an image without actually always following. I think the point we're saying is it's about following it up with action. That's I think what the previous article and some of the things you said was about, isn't it? Really, I think Cameron didn't follow it up really with action because of austerity, and Theresa May sort of started to. I think what we sort of argued today is Boris Johnson's attention could go there, couldn't he, if he follows up. If he follows up with like red meat, as it were, on the policy front, I think that's what we're sort of arguing, is it, Mike? Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Andrew?
You may have likely made a point that we want to find this as a unionist party, but does that extend to electoral, potential electoral gains, or what would be the best way to get them the biggest possible power base in England? Because if you weren't a unionist party and basically said goodbye to Scotland, they would have pretty much, I would suggest, possibly wrong with on the electoral system, which was those on. Pretty much solid grip on power in England in perpetuity. So then is there, is there one nation conservatism truly a solid part of their identity? Or will they at one point go, we've lost Scotland, we might as well trade because we can maintain that grip on England?
Yes, I think the unionism was very deep in the Conservative Party. I think, as Ben said before, there's maybe a chance that the union could break up. It's more conceivable now as a result of Brexit that Northern Ireland could potentially reunite. Scotland could go further down the route towards independence. And it makes perfect electoral sense, as you said, for the Conservative Party to become a purely English party. Labour, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's only won four majorities in England, as distinct from Britain. 45, 66, 97, 2001. So it would, if England was a separate political entity, it would give the Conservative Party a clear electoral strength. But nevertheless, despite that, it is still committed, I would argue, to maintain that unionism was deep within the politics of the Conservative Party.
I think we've got, Kieran's got his hand up. So you want to ask a question, Kieran?
Yeah, thank you very much. So can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. I'm kind of, apologies, some of the questions weren't entirely clear to the Zoom audience, but so apologies if this has already been covered, but it seems to me that a key thing about the One Nation tradition, or the One Nation point, is that it's a conservative rhetorical point that that our two-party system is dividing us into antagonistic interest groups, and the Tory party is going to transcend that and produce a particular a unified view of everyone's interests that most people will buy into. And so the evidence that Johnson would point to at this stage would be, well, they broke down the red wall, but the blue wall stayed up. It's not particularly that there's any signature policies as part of the One Nation position. It's more that that there's an aim to represent everyone's interests in an equal and non-antagonistic way. And this is why the term levelling up is used. It means we've got to improve the position of northern constituencies relative to southern constituencies, but there won't be an absolute decrease in the prosperity, etc., of southern constituencies. So the point is here that the red wall gets knocked down and the Tories start to get MPs up north, while the blue wall stays up. Now, of course, a remark someone else made earlier, the proof of the pudding is in the eating here. So once those levelling up policies come in, will the blue wall remain up, or will it start to be vulnerable to attack from the Lib Dems or from Labour? It looks to me like the blue wall is vulnerable, and so it may well be that the levelling up agenda, if it's seen purely as pumping money up to the north, is not going to appeal to the south, and so we've got to go back into our two antagonistic interest groups, which seems to be happening. In that context, and this is kind of bringing Andy into it as well, in that context, it looks to be like populism starts to be a possible strategy for a one nation conservative group, if you think that the establishment is very much against the interests of, is working very much against the interests of everyone. And the evidence for that is not only that Johnson would put forward, is not only that the establishment opposed Brexit, but also there's the sort of the culture wars and the illiberal left, which was mentioned by the first talk of the day. And so I just wonder whether there's a recrafting not only of conservatism, but also one nation conservatism in a way, bringing in some populist elements in order to unite the interests of the north and south of Britain. And whether that's happening successfully or not, who knows? Probably not. But so I just wonder whether that's a point of view that anyone would like to comment on. Sorry, that was a bit incoherent, but I was sort of thinking on the fly. Apologies.
Speaker wanted.
Yeah, so Andy, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, there's also a question from Mark that I can try and respond to, and I suppose I want to emphasise the word "try" in the response, because one of the questions Mark's asking there is about whether we should characterise Johnson as non-ideological. I think no would be my question. He's attached to the Brexit project, which, for all the talk or the rhetoric, if you want to call it there, of global Britain, was about a withdrawal from a part of the globe at the very least, and about the revival of nationalism. The other thing that I want to emphasise about the ideology of conservatism and Johnson especially is that, to put it in as simple terms as possible, there are hierarchies that exist within the establishment that have been here for centuries. Georgina kind of characterizes them very, very well, and effectively the project is about preserving those hierarchies. So there is an ideology, I think, attached to Johnson, and this may come to Kieran's question. I think it's, if you want to, if you look at the policies which have been pursued of late, the turn is very much towards a larger state. That should be quite obvious from Sunak's quite surprising announcement this week, and you can trace it back to COVID as well. To try and perhaps patch together, it seems to me like a kind of stick and plaster policy, some kind of unity, but this is never done against the establishment. I just want to reiterate one of the points I was making in my presentation. I think the only way in which you could say that Johnson has mobilised the people against either the elite or the establishment was the people versus Parliament, and I think he'll struggle in order to engage or try to, if you want to call it, a kind of revive a populist approach.
You want to say, yeah?
I was just going to come in and reply to I think what Kieran asked. I think that was a that was a valid point about this argument that in trying to keep and win the red wall, you might lose the blue wall. I think there have been some articles. I think there's some political insight about it, like in the last 6 months, suggesting that. And I think that's like a kind of speculative point going forward, because there's a Conservative MP yesterday saw in the debate stood up and accused Sunak of imposing socialism via this windfall tax. So he's obviously going to have problems, isn't he, Johnson, going forward, in trying to keep the northern red wall seat on board. He potentially is going to antagonise the more wealthier areas where they're going to be paying more tax and not necessarily seeing the delivery benefiting them. And that's going to be like the balance of that is going to be a real challenge. And that again goes back to what we said. Is he going to be able to like deliver it basically, which is still unknown.
Okay, I think to stay on schedule, we'll leave it there then. So thanks to both papers. We will, so it's around about 12:30 now. We will come back at 1:15 when we will have the keynote from Robert Saunders. So we'll see you then.
Yeah.